Albright. I am the chair of the Professional Development Committee for the Arkansas Museums Association. And welcome to our first AMA virtual session. We've got several of these lined up, but poor Josh gets to be the guinea pig here. And even though we're all used to Zoom, it still feels like there's a lot to learn. I am so grateful, as I know the whole board is, to all of our presenters for their willingness to switch their in-person presentations that they had prepared for our annual conference in March to the virtual sessions that we're going to be seeing over the next few months. And please note that this session is being recorded, so don't say anything that you wouldn't say to, you know, well, just know it's being recorded. How about that? We also have closed captioning happening. And if you want the closed caption feature, you can turn it on at the bottom of your screen, hover over that. But also at the end of the session, you'll get a data file with the closed captioning as well. I will send out the recording. I will not have the skills likely to edit a recording much, unless you say something really awful. And I will be sending that out to all the registrants. So you can either watch in, or people who signed up who couldn't come will have it available to them. I also want to thank our sponsors who make this virtual world possible for us. The Arkansas Humanities Council granted us money for our Zoom subscription, and JAMA Best and Melanie Thornton funded the closed captioning services so that we would have that accessibility. And I also want to thank all of the volunteers who make this organization work. Several of you are here, actually. And we are an all-volunteer association, and its members are really obviously committed to the mutual support of the museum sector in Arkansas, which is pretty great. The Arkansas Museum's website has the links to a list of all the rest of our sessions, and as they become available to register, those links will be live. So our next one is November 18th, and it is the top 10 tips for everyday digital accessibility with Melanie Thornton from the U of A Partners for Inclusive Communities. And I've been in one of those sessions with her, it's great. Okay, so this session, Museum Code of Ethics, Does It Apply to Me?, is a roundtable discussion. So we anticipate interaction and discussion. If you would mute yourselves when you're not talking, or else just, I mean, I'll be muting myself because I'm sitting next to the phone in our museum and I'm the only one here. So, so that we just eliminate some of the distractions. Use the chat or the raise your hand feature when you're ready to chime in, or there might be few enough of us that you can also just kind of jump in. We'll see how that goes. And I will attempt to monitor the chat, but be patient with me if I get it wrong or if I miss something. Okay, on to the show. So often in our day-to-day jobs, we're busy putting out fires and doing kind of just our daily things, and we don't have a chance to always pause and think about the bigger picture and our profession in general. And that's why I was really excited when Josh submitted a proposal for this discussion of museum ethics. This is the big picture stuff. Josh Williams has been curator at the Historic Washington State Park for 10 years. He also taught an Intro to Museums course for John Brown University, and he has an MA in History and an MLIS degree in Archival Science. He's been a member of the Arkansas Museum Association, Arkansas Living History Association, and the Arkansas Historical Association for 13 years. And now I'm going to turn it over to Josh.
Thank you, Angie, with that. Yeah, so it's good to be here and to speak. And I think, am I the host now, Angie?
You are the host. Yep.
Okay, gotcha. So I'll be sharing a presentation here in just a minute with that. But yeah, this particular one was one I was interested in, and part of it was I had questions on certain things, and it was like I was wanting some input from the rest of the professionals in the association and other places, if you had dealt with this, what their thoughts were. Like, you know, we were at our museum was talking about, which I work at Historic Washington State Park down in Southwest Arkansas. There was just a couple of different events, which I'll mention later when we're going through them, with some of the different codes. Like, does that match or does that conflict with the Code of Ethics? I'm not for sure. And so that's where I wanted to take kind of this time, was to bring this to the association and we kind of visit with it and see what everyone's thoughts were about some of these things. And my goal here is I'm just going to get a little background on the code. And then we're going to go through, there's 3 different sections with this. And then I guess we'll go through each of the different points in those sections, and that'll be open for discussion to see if anyone has thoughts or questions on that as well with it. But right now, let me go ahead and I'm going to share the presentation. And yeah, and of course, okay, here we are with the presentation I have here. I've worked at Historic Washington for 10 years, but I've always kind of been in the museum profession. It's volunteered, I mean, particularly here in Washington, since I was age, at least 10, if not older, younger than that. But I was involved with Civil War reenacting, so I was involved with that here. Grew up going to different museums, enjoying it, helping with programs, doing those type of things. So I really grew up buying into the vision and enjoying museums and what museums were about. And in some ways, always dreamt of working in one. And after I got done with all my college education, of course, maybe I was crazy. This is where I came right after graduating, was back here to Washington. And started here back in 2006. I was the park historian for a few years, and then moved up to curator after that. So, but it's something I've always been interested in and always enjoyed going to see museums. Grew up, my dad loves American Civil War history. So growing up, there was not a single battlefield we did not see, I think, pretty much. There were some times, unfortunately, I got tired of seeing a battlefield, and I unfortunately prevented my dad from seeing one of his most favorite ones, that not Antietam, but is Manassas 2. It's like after I see another cannon, it's like going, okay, it's time. We need to move on. But so I hope to take him back there again one day to repay and not be the cranky 11-year-old that went to see it. But it's just those type of things. And like I said, going to a variety of museums. My wife that I married, we're friends from college, but she is from New Hampshire. And of course, when we go see some of her family members up in New Hampshire, what do? I was like going, oh, let's go see this museum or this museum over here. And we went to, like, of course, to the home site of President Franklin Pierce, president in the 1850s. Who's from New Hampshire originally. And she grew up there all her and never had been there. So it was new for her, and she enjoyed it as well to see that treasure that's in New Hampshire. And that's really what we are as museums, is, I think, and that's kind of the gist of the Code of Ethics, in a way, what they sum up here in it. We are kind of the caretakers of cultural history and treasures, and not just necessarily culture, but also in terms of zoos, in terms of nature museums, you name it, science museums, caretakers of those things. Now, there's a link that was put into the initial introduction into this workshop, and that takes you a link directly to the page for the American Alliance of Museums and the Code of Ethics. I don't know if all of you printed that or not. Like I said, I'll be going through most of them, but one of the things that I did highlight on there that is their introduction into this is that it is incumbent museums to be resources for humankind in all their activities to foster an informed appreciation of the rich and diverse world we have inherited. It's also incumbent upon them to preserve that inheritance for posterity. And most of us are in probably either education or, well, I guess it's a mixture. Some of us are managers, some of us are curators, some of us are education, some of us are all 3, all that put together. But that's kind of our goal for our sites, is to preserve that these places have become museums, maybe not from our work. They've been previous people that laid the foundation to make these places happen. But they were done for an important reason, because they felt this stuff be preserved, shared, the local community and country sometimes, because one of our places get people all over the country, maybe even world, that come to visit them. On this screen, I'm sorry that I didn't have room to put every picture of every museum, but as many of y'all know, this is just highlighting some of the different museums we have, diverse museums in our local association. So you have the Museum of Science and Discovery up there in downtown Little Rock that focuses on science. Always has some great exhibits, particularly with science. I've taken my kids there with it. Over here is Crystal Bridges, Museum of Art. Again, world-class, I mean, a lot of money spent to help make a museum with that. We all wish we had that endowment or money with that one, but brought some amazing paintings in that shocked the rest of the United States, like going, where are you taking these? Arkansas, what? That type of thing. So it's amazing treasure right here in Heartland in the United States with it. Oh, excuse me, I went back. And then of course we have like the Clinton House Museum right here in Fayetteville. Down the road from me is the National Park birthplace site for President Clinton. Treasures there. I mean, of course, it documented a person came from Arkansas that became president of the United States, just like Franklin Pierce in New Hampshire. And many other states have for previous presidents with that. Mosaic Templar and down in Little Rock, of course. I mean, with that, focusing on African-American history in Arkansas. We have Jacksonport State Park that talks about, Angela, the history of that region in Northeast Arkansas, particularly along the White River with it and its importance there. And then over here, we have several just local county museums and regional museums like Calico Rock. Shiloh Museum would be another one. Many of the different other local community ones, like there's one on my street, Nevada County Depot Museum, just many of those that help continue preserving that community heritage in our local counties and the state. So those are amazing ones. So a large variety of many different ones that make their own impact in preserving and doing that. And with this, the importance is to keep the importance with the Code of Ethics is trying to, like with any association, is having a professional. What do we stand for? What do we museums for to make this better and to promote and to make all of our entities the best that they can be with that. So that's the main goal with this, with the Code of Ethics, is to continue to do that in that way. These particular ones that we're going to be thinking about, they were adopted in 1993 and later revised in 2000. I'm not for sure exactly what the revisions were, but there has been no updates as far as I'm understanding. Correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone has seen otherwise, since 2000 with that. There may be more coming up with that, possibly. Who knows? But every museum's encouraged to adopt them. Some of you may have gone, I know Old State House has gone through this, Historic Arkansas Museum, Shiloh, other museums out there may have gone through the museum accreditation process through American Museum. And as part of that, you have to, of course, ensure that you want to abide by these code of ethics as well. Part of that stamp of approval from the American Alliance of Museums. But they always encourage every museum to adopt these. Again, some of the things that they point out here is loyalty to the mission of the museum and to the public it serves is the essence of museum work. Basically, you're in this to help promote. If you work in a museum, it's not for your own personal gain. It's for promoting and taking care of that museum and its mission to serve the public. It's a public, even though you may not be public funded, like a state park or a state museum, it's all private funds. It is still considered a public service. You're doing this, it's a nonprofit, 501c3, those type of things. You are doing this for that. It does beg into question sometimes because there's some places I've been and it's one of those you go back and forth like going, well, and we can get into that a little bit earlier. Some of you may have been to it, but there's like, for example, you go to the Titanic Museum in Branson. And there are artifacts there, I mean, in the museum, and it is an amazing layout. I mean, and some of the educational things that they have there, they have like a pool of ice that you can put your hand in, see kind of the idea of how cold the water was that night. The amazing thing that always impacted me when I've been to that one is at the very end, they have a list of all the names of people that died, and we'll have different oral history recordings. And a thing that always impacted me, I forgot her name, but she was a little girl at the time, and they have her recording where she says she remembers saying goodbye to her dad. And like I said, she's 10 or something at the time, not that old. And they did this oral history back in the 70s. And he says, be good, obey your mother, and I'll see you soon. And of course, she never saw her father again. But that's quite an impact. And they do the service of a museum, but they are kind of more for profit in a way type of museum. So that's where it kind of gets into a little bit more of the question with the code of ethics. But again, key that they mention in here is public service is paramount. That's the whole goal of our museums, and to educate people about all of our different missions and our niches with that, in that case. Any questions on that so far? If anyone has? Okay. We're going to go into it and start discussing these different ones. And the first part is going to be on governance, and what that means with your governing body of your museum and so forth. But real quick, I want to show you one particular thing that kind of puts this in mind about the purpose of museums and our goals.
Too small for two of us. This is the second time I've had to reclaim my property from you. It belongs in a museum. So do you.
Okay, can everyone hear that? Okay, good. All right. Yeah, and most of y'all probably seen that episode from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, one of my favorite movies. I always comment about like going, I struggle, me and the archivist that's next door, archival manager of the regional archives here in Washington, always debate like, we're always struggling with that Indiana Jones complex. And like, it belongs in a museum. Now, was Indiana Jones always correct in how he went about it, getting the stuff in the museum? Maybe not. Not the right way with it. Oh, wait. Hang on just a minute.
And I just want to say it's a retainer of rare antiquity.
Okay, there we go. Sorry. Okay, let me see where I'm at. Okay, we've seen green again. PowerPoint. Everyone nod your head if you see the screen. Okay, good. All right, so here, our first one we're going to talk about is governance with that. And one of the first ones here is all those who work for on behalf of the museum understand and support its mission and public trust responsibilities. And one of the biggest things is to make sure your museum does have a mission. What is the mission? And that's kind of your guiding principle, kind of your way to keep going. I mean, like what you do with everything and what you collect, all that falls into place. So your mission is very important. What is your main goal as a museum? With that, for us, Historic Washington, our mission is basically states we preserve and interpret to our visitors the history of Washington, Arkansas in the 19th century, emphasizing its cultural and architectural history and the historic restoration process. So the keys there for us is we're particularly focused on a specific time in history, the 19th century. So from 1801 to 1900. That's what we're looking at when we talk about different things, exhibits, our collections, and so forth. That's a big thing to check on with that and to follow that in many ways. We're sort of been in this in state parks because they go like, oh, what's your mission state? What's your mission state? And then say, but that's one of the big things right there with it. So make sure to keep that in mind. Does that have a mission there or have any issues with your mission?
You cut out a little bit there, Josh. Will you say that again?
Does everyone have a mission? Is there anyone that doesn't have a mission? And do you have any issues with your mission?
I will say, like, for us, the mission is, like, we have that, but reminding a board of directors of that, or even like the CEO of the umbrella organization, she has a very different job in tourism. And so trying to keep everybody on, well, and other staff sometimes too, like they have some great idea for an exhibit, but it doesn't fit our mission. And so trying to steer people down one lane when everybody wants to go down 50, I find that part kind of hard. But it's also why the mission statement is really helpful, because then you can pull it out and say, well, that is a great idea, but it doesn't really fit our mission.
And Angie, like for you, you're under the tourism department of the bill, isn't that correct?
Right.
Technically?
And there is a board of directors that acts in an advisory capacity, and they're about to run the place. And so, I mean, that relationship's about to change. And so it's going to be even more important next year.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
I realize that working for parks, but I mean, Josh and my other parks colleagues are familiar with this as well. But for us, it's really helped us having a strong mission, because it also guides not only our interpretive plans and goals, but also things like our collections plan and what we accept, what we don't, how we manage that, which has also been quite helpful because it branches not only into how we operate, but in other areas as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I found, like, at least with us, because we have other sort of groups within state government too, like we have our planning and development group that does kind of our building structures and stuff, and there, and that mission in some ways helps keep them on track too with different things in our the way our system is set up with state parks. But a very important thing to have and to understand that and your board, and it can be tough because there's a lot of them that think like, oh, this other museum did this and they made a lot of money off that, let's do that, or let's bring so-and-so in and do that, or oh, they're doing a drive-in movie over there at the college, we can do that too. And so like here in Washington, I'm just, this is all fictitious. It's like going, oh, let's just show Nightmare Before Christmas here in historic Washington. It's like, does that have anything to do with our mission? Not really. So those things right there are always to keep in mind with it.
We have a mission statement in Calico, but we have had the same one that we started 12 years ago, and we've expanded so much that I'm not sure that everything is totally in it. The mission statement is very broad. It needs to be kind of narrowed down a little bit so that we can know exactly what should we do and what we shouldn't do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that'd be good with that. Yeah, and that's good to do, and just to kind of try to tweak it more like, what is your focus? What are you really trying to focus on? That now at Calico Rock, y'all have a science museum too, along with a cultural museum, right?
We have a science museum. We have an arts center. We have an antique store as well under our umbrella. And so it really, when you say we're keeping the past alive, that's kind of broad. You need to kind of break it down a little bit more than keeping the past alive.
Yeah, right. But I've got to see that one last year at Calico Rock. I was very, very impressed though with it.
Thank you.
The next one is members understand and fulfill their trusteeship and act corporately, not as individuals. And again, it can be sometimes conflict within the governing board. I mean, we, state parks, I guess we don't get this much because we don't have a board per se. We have the commission over all of state parks, but a lot of you I know have individual boards, like you were mentioning at Clinton and Calico and other places, and just trying to make sure that they're not trying to do this for their own individual gain with that, in that respect. The museum's collections and programs and its physical, human, and financial resources are protected, maintained, and developed in support of the museum's mission. So like trying to protect with jobs and everything and what those resources are used for. I've seen times where, I guess I shouldn't in the town, but where the museum, local museum was under the city Parks and Recreation Department. And so they would use the museum manager for doing everything else but taking care of the museum in a lot of ways. They would be at the softball games. They would be helping maintain things like, apparently in this town, the Parks and Tourism are also over the local airport. So they'd be out there working at the airport. I mean, just everything but the museum in a way. So those are some aspects that I can see right there. Does anyone else have another example with that? Okay. It is responsive to, represents the interest of society. So staying relevant. I mean, basically what you're doing. And this is kind of, we're kind of sort of dealing that even with today with things, but trying to be relevant to society. And that's in many ways, helps you with your bread and butter, basically getting people just through the door, you know, for income and so forth. And to buy things in the gift shop, those type of things with that, but just keeping it relevant to where people are interested in what you're doing and not just do the same old thing over and over and over, or possibly tweaking it a little bit to what you're talking about. We talk about the 19th century in Washington, and that, like we're having discussions throughout this year and stuff. I mean, it can be a very touchy subject sometimes with different things in the 19th century, because we also in Washington talk about slavery. We have some people that portray, do first person as slaves. We also do have people that do free people as well on staff. But it's trying to figure out a way to connect that with people and to talk about how and make that relevant to today. And I know in history museum, well, any museum, it's not just history, but I mean, there's really nothing times that is irrelevant. You can make it relevant in a way. There's some way, there's a lot of things that we talked about in the 19th century, people are still dealing with today. And a lot of times people talk about how the newspapers all side with a particular political party. And so for us in Washington, we point out, well, the newspapers were no different in the 19th century. The Arkansas Gazette supported the Whig Party. Local paper, the Washington Telegraph, supported the Whig Party. And you had the Arkansas Democrat, of course, supported the Democrats. And they could be pretty ruthless to each other sometimes with some of the different commentary. I know other spots that talk about it, like we talk about, I'm not going to go deep into politics here, but we talk about how people do a lot of mudslinging, and sites like John Adams' site and so forth talk about how it was pretty bad in 1800. I mean, how they mudslinged, and they called John Adams this, I'm going to rip it up, I forgot what it was, but they called him a hermaphroditical something that had not a sense of a woman or the stamina of a man. I mean, horrible things. They're just calling these people. So I mean, it just, yeah, it's nothing new. It's nothing new. There are ways to make your place relevant without, because this, I think sometimes people break away from their mission because they think they need to be relevant. But a lot of times your mission can help you stay relevant. It's just being creative and thinking, just like how with the COVID thing right now. So many people through grants and other things in our association have done digital programming to be relevant and to keep it going. So those are important ways right there for the interest of society and to keep that connection with people with it.
Josh, I would say, I know for me, this is something I think about a lot, and it is really hard to be responsive to sort of what's happening in the day. I mean, you're always walking a fine line, I think, between sort of what's happening in a moment and so much of what we do, like, there are exhibits I can't get until 2022, right? That would be really great and relevant to the museum and today, but they're not available till 2022 or later. And so, trying to always figure out how to be both responsive and at the same time true to your mission, I think is one of the finest lines to walk. And then, like, how often do you go back and reevaluate your exhibits to change the language to match our times? And like, is there a schedule for that, or should we be doing that annually? Should we? I don't know what it is, but I find that one of the hardest parts, because I think museums can be catalysts for lots of cool things through programming, but exhibit development takes a long time and
money.
Anyway.
That's a good point, because I don't have an answer either with that. And that's why I want to be clear. I'm not trying to get any answers here either. This is an open forum discussion with this. It's just one of those things. And I don't know, we've never really sat down and done time, because you get so caught up in the regular routine and not, I guess, mundane things sometimes, but just the regular routine of trying to finish the programs going to the next program, people and so forth, that, sometimes evaluating pushed to the back corner. So you don't get as quick enough with it, or every year, like you're saying. So, but it's something to consider with that, very much so. And then making an exhibit, I'll just say, like, for us, I mean, a lot of times we're on a shoestring budget, even us for temporary exhibits, and a lot of you can relate to that. And sometimes, because trying to do time, we have a good idea with the exhibit, but we may have just a month or two to get it done and get it out there. Sometimes we don't have as much time, like 6 months out to plan it or something. So that can happen too. Anything else?
Because I'm a site very similar to you, Josh, and your time frame and whatnot. But I think one thing that this year has taught us, if nothing else, is the need to maybe not reinvent the wheel, but maybe it's shaken up our perceptions and how we present things, and caused us to maybe not like rip down every permanent exhibit we have, obviously, but take a good hard look at, okay, when was the last time we revisited our research or our mission or our programs, or, how do we present ourselves to the public has become increasingly relevant. I mean, that's what we do for a living. That's why we do this. But this year has really brought to mind on a global scale what stories are being presented and how. And if nothing else, hopefully we can just take a good hard look at how we do what we do, and what needs to change, doesn't need to change. How can we be flexible and flexible, relevant, stay within our mission, stay within our budget. But
well, Angela, you make a really good point about, I hadn't really thought about this, but like, I went to graduate school a long time ago. And so I have this in-depth knowledge of the subjects I studied in graduate school, but I can't keep up to that level in that subject area today still, with the other duties in life and such. And so revisiting the actual research so that we can update the things that we do have and the things we say and how we interpret them, gosh, that seems like that ought to be on the calendar to, I don't know how we make time for that, but it just occurred to me that's really important. And how do you keep up with the current research and attitudes and strains of thinking in the field that you know best?
And maybe not that, we have to do everything right now, but at the very least, it'll start some conversations that might not have come to the forefront previously, of at least, and not that we need to, not that it's exactly necessary to overhaul everything every year, but maybe if nothing else, this is just sort of giving us a little, for lack of a better term, I guess, wake up call of maybe it is time we evaluate some of these programs or, that sort of thing. And goodness knows we're all, everybody is dealing with their own stuff this year and on a variety of levels. But for what it's worth, I mean, maybe it just made us mindful, I guess, in a lot of ways. And so, and not just, I mean, pretty much on every level we have, it's made us mindful of how we do things. And I mean, from finances to governance to boards to interpretation to, I mean, there's no aspect of our professional lives that hasn't been affected this year in one way or another. And so,
Yeah.
So thank you, Josh, for hosting this, by the way.
It's
It's just a lot more relevant than, your average ordinary year.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I'll probably keep moving on with it. With the other ones, the museum maintains a relationship with staff, which shared rules are recognized, and individual responsibilities are respected, and separate responsibilities respected. And this just, I guess with this, one example is for us. I mean, there's some shared capacity where we're a larger museum, so we have different people that do things from maintenance to interpretation to curation to the admin side. We have restaurants, we have a restaurant. So each has their own individual responsibility, but yet we do all have a shared role of promoting that mission too. And sort of interlap. I for sure, and this is always the museum dilemma, the curation and the interpretive of the educational side always interlap and have to work closely together on some things. So, and now smaller museums, you do all of these jobs. And sometimes it's working with those roles with the board members that want to be very heavily involved and then respect their role and those type of things too. So that's one thing there is helping maintain that. It's just the team to work together with that. Working relationship, let me see, working relationship among trustees, employees, volunteers are based on equity and mutual respect. So like this, and probably everyone has these statements, but again, respecting those with all the differences and support that come and help that work for you and volunteer for you. To be honest, I don't really know too many museums that really, are probably too disrespectful to their volunteers. They need their volunteers. It can happen, of course. There is some times when that can, but mutual respect with everyone. Because you can have some different ideas on it. Again, going back to that mission with it. Professional standard practices inform and guide museum operations, like we're talking here, things that sort of flesh out that way. More of this into more details, though what it's talking there. Policies are articulated and oversight is practiced through like your manager system or governing board. They need to be involved. I know many a board that's not involved and just meet and that's it, or dying board. They need to be involved.
Yeah, but the opposite is when they're too involved, like, right?
Yes.
I mean, I'm on those boards too. And again, it's another fine line. Like, how do you keep them engaged and yet not messing around in the day-to-day?
Right.
I mean,
Again,
I
going back to
think
that,
it's hard.
respecting the relationship.
Yes, yes, good point, yes.
Yeah. And then the governance promotes the public good and the individual financial gain. So again, this is to fill the pockets of the people on the board. The goal here is, we're here as a nonprofit for the public good, or for the state. I mean, it's the same idea. We just aren't technically a nonprofit if you're a state or federal museum, but in the same way, in the same vein with that, which is where sometimes it's like, you like things like the Titanic Museum. Does anyone have on private, financial profit museums in that way? Titanic. I mean, I like them. I like going to them. But I mean, does it conflict with our code of ethics?
The International Spy Museum.
Yeah,
So is that for profit?
Yeah, the International Spy Museum in DC. Yeah, it's a for-profit museum. But they are so fun, and they have like wonderful interactive education programs and stuff, and like they teach you how to be a spy.
I failed that test, by the way.
I did not. What?
Well, does that have a Marie? That was the spy museum?
That's me. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
gotcha.
Yeah. Now you all know my secret identity job is a spy. Because I've been trained and I passed.
We have a couple of privately owned for-profit museums, right, in Arkansas. I'm thinking of the Gangster Museum in Hot Springs. And I think there are a couple of others, but I don't remember what they are.
I think there's another one in Hot Springs too, and I can't remember the name of it.
There's like a railroad museum there, I think.
Okay.
Is it railroad or miniature? There's another tiny little one there.
Yeah, there are some veterans in the museum world who feel strongly that for-profit museums are not real museums, but I don't know.
It has a wax museum.
Oh yeah, that's right. It does.
Yeah, there's the wax museum. I don't know if it's for profit or not. I mean, sometimes it's hard to tell too, which is, I think, what's really interesting is because you can have nonprofit museums who, like had a conversation about this with a non-museum person, and to them, it was cut and dry. If you charged admission, then you were a for-profit museum, and if you didn't charge for admission, then you must have been a nonprofit. And it's like, no, there are a lot of nonprofit museums that charge admission.
And that's an IRS distinction, not a commerce. That's
right.
Yeah, that's not how it works. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nonprofits can make money. They are allowed to make money.
Yes.
That's interesting.
And maybe a way to look at it too, I mean, I'm just thinking this right now, and sort of goes into the next section of Code of Ethics, is how are they using that money? Is it mainly to get a bigger paycheck for once they're in charge, or is it going to make the museum better with the collection and everything else that it does and outreach? Maybe that's sort of, what do y'all think? That could be the distinguishing line right there.
I think there are probably plenty of ethical ways to have a for-profit museum if they're doing work that's in the public good. I'm sure it's possible.
Just out of curiosity, because this is not my sphere at all, but is there like a AAM distinction at all for what's a for-profit and that differentiates them? Or like Angie says, is it just more of an IRS distinction? Because you can have, I mean, technically because I had a conversation with the Titanic Museum in Florida, matter of fact, back in February, and their staff is getting trained, I assume, through NAI. So they're shifting some of their focus as well, which is kind of interesting in that, just how they do their programming as well. So I'm just kind of curious if there's an actual like set in stone kind of difference.
Not to my knowledge, and I think that's really interesting too, because and I it's hard to distinguish, but I think to Josh's point, and a lot of times maybe it does go back to the mission, because I know like at the International Spy Museum, I have gotten in a couple of times by just flashing my employment badge and saying, "Hey, I work at a museum. Do you have some kind of reciprocal program?" And I've either gotten a discount or gotten in free. I've done that at the Titanic Museum in Branson, and they look at me like I have horns coming out of my head or something. They're just like, they're just like, what? And it's like, well, and I'm a member of the American Alliance of Museums, and they're like, what's that? You know? So, and my husband was with me, and he was like, sweetheart, they're not that kind of museum. Like it's obvious nobody here in their frontline staff is thinking of them as that kind of museum.
Well, I probably need to move on, go into the collections aspect now, and I just want one other clip real quick for you with this. Let's see.
Today, me learn lesson about the etiquette, how to behave. Now me tell you, for instance, you see a picture of me, look like chocolate hair, vanilla dress, almond eyes, cheeks color, oatmeal cookie, and you say, see the picture with lady inside, look so delicious, me fit to be fine. Me love to eat with sugar and cream. No, 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 mean the rule. It's exciting, not winding. Don't need the pictures. Don't need the pictures. Don't need the pictures. When you go to the museum. Oh boy, it keeps it moving. Look like banana picture. Oh, 3,000 years old? Should be right now. See the mummy, oh, oh, oh. It ended Egypt long time ago. Me love to bake it for steam. But no, 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 me know the rule. Me look young, but it's not for dummies. Don't need the mummies. Alright, don't need the mummies. Heard you, don't need the mummies. When you go to museum, you put in mouth, peas and carrots, cake and cookies and pie. But it's not cooking, it's meant for looking. So if hungry, eat with your eyes. Oh boy, feast for eyes, delicious statue. See pretty statue so smooth and so white. Look like ice cream, me long for a bite. Me to nibble, but me wouldn't leave. No, 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 the rule. Statue viewing is not for chewing. Don't eat the statues. Just get here, don't come on me. No, no, I feel it. Don't eat the pictures. Me know when you go to museum.
So, I mean, I had little kids and we watched that one, and that's always different pictures. We did, but with Cookie Monster. But next one in this is taking care of the collection with that. And that's one of your primary goals. That's what, in some ways, makes the museum is the collection. Again, the collection in its custody supports its mission and public trust responsibilities. So what you collect, again, this always goes back to the mission. You need to collect what your mission's about. What are you trying to collect with that? And there's in ours, like I said, we mainly focus on 19th century. There were some things collected that were from the 1940s, 1950s, but have no connection whatsoever to Washington itself. We even had in the collection a air tank for some reason. That's no longer there. That was more modern from 1980s, but succession. So those are things right there. I mean, that's the main thing with the collection. Collections in custody are lawfully held, protected, secured, unencumbered, cared for, and preserved. Collections in its custody, museums custody are accounted for, documented. This is probably really important. Now, this on the curator side, where this is coming out in the registrar side, is to count of all and to make sure that they are accounted for and numbered and documented with every piece that you have in the collection with that.
I wonder if it's just me or if I hear this one the most, like at conferences and among other museum people. I know that when I came into my museum, all of our collections were stuffed in a closet and just piled on top of each other, and there was no documentation. And it's taken us 4 years to get there, and it's all taken. I consider that my lasting legacy for this museum, but I've heard this so many times that museums' collections are a disaster, and that surprises me. I don't know if that's just I've picked up on it because that was my situation, or if that's really true.
I think you're right, Angie. I mean, particularly, even we were that way. I mean, and we signed from previous years. We were state funded, but it came in 10 years ago, and there were so many things that weren't numbered correctly, or the files weren't there. The paperwork it was spread out all over the place. And so it has taken me 10 years it's still not complete. I want it to be consolidating all that stuff in one place where you can find it easily. The backup information, putting that in a database, and ensure everything is cataloged and looked for correctly with that. So they're not alone with that. And it's just like all your daily activities sometimes pop up and get in the way of doing that.
Yeah.
Well, and the thing
Anyone
with
else have a comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, because I've dealt with exactly, Josh, what you and Angie were saying too, is collections management is one of those things that it almost needs a dedicated person, and it's one of those, it's very, in running the day to day when you're wearing every hat you can imagine, it's often one of the things that tends to fall by the wayside because it takes such a detailed focus to do it correctly. That I'm sure, I mean, pretty much everybody I'm seeing on screen has had some issue with it. The parks people I know have had discussions about it. And some problems are inherited, some problems well, many of them are inherited. But yeah, I don't think you're alone at all in that.
One I want to point out here is particularly, this is one I have a question of that sometimes comes up, but is acquisition, disposal, and loan activities are conducted in a manner that respects the protection and preservation of natural and cultural resources and discourages illicit in such materials. One thing I've run into, brought up, and our museum did it back in the 80s, at times it's been brought up again as an option to bring people in and connect it with it. But should we host an antique show or a gun trade show? For us, we have a large gun collection. We have over 650 firearms. They're mainly one-man collection, primarily, that it has its own dedicated museum. But should we host our own gun show that people basically sell and barter with their guns? Should we allow that? And I guess I want to put that question out there. What do y'all think about things like that? Do you think that would be a conflict of the code or permissible?
That's a hard one.
Yeah, it's being at an art museum now is very interesting in that regard because, you know, we have Dale Chihuly's work in our collection, and yet we're selling Dale Chihuly work in our gift shop. You know, and there have been a lot of recent stories about art museums and how they're starting to, you know, deaccession some of their holdings and auction them off. And it's not as uncommon in art museums as it is in like history and science museums. Like I can't recall the last time I heard of a history or science museum auctioning off deaccessioned items, but you hear about it quite frequently in art museums, and it's really interesting conundrum, and I still can't figure out how I feel about it.
I know
Well,
what you mean,
Josh, when
Heather.
Well, Heather
when
Marie,
you're
you're
talking
also
about
good.
guns too, that's another level of a societal issue. Right?
Yes.
So it
Mhm.
totally fits your mission. You have a museum, you know, full 650 guns. So potentially it fits your mission, right? But at the same time,
Correct.
are you going to bring attention to the state park that you don't actually want? I mean, both in terms
Right.
of protests or in who shows up. I mean, ugh, I'm glad I don't have to decide that one.
And I have a friend, she's been in the archives field, an archaeologist too, and she's very much a stance about selling artifacts in a way, particularly archaeological, which is its own other realm. But she's very much about, because she feels it continues to promote the sale, you know, the system. And sometimes, but I know even as museums, sometimes in order to get an artifact to get it for the public, we almost have to buy it at auction in order to preserve it for posterity. There's really no other option. They're not going to donate it to us. So,
Yeah.
um,
In the chat, Nicole's mentioning that they've had some issues, but come a long way.
now is Nicole, okay, good. I was
She
going
said-
into something for Nicole in just a minute.
Yeah, the Museum of Native American History. Yeah.
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 Sadly, her audio is not working.
Okay. But I did have, it was on the next page was one that I wanted her to kind of chime in on if she could with that. But
Well, she'll probably
that's
use the chat.
okay. I kind of just have always wondered that. I still am uncomfortable having an antique show, though, as I've told my higher ups, as well as a gun show, just because I thought, is that promoting more than what we need to be with that?
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Well,
one thing I run into, just tell you this with the gun, for example, was we had to do some extra paperwork to get a firearm. This was a lady's husband, collected firearms in North Carolina. He passed away. She didn't want the collection, of course, so she gave it to a gun seller to break it up and get rid of it. But one particular firearm fell just below the description rifle, so it fell into the pistol category. And it was one that was made for ladies to fire in the 19-teens. It had both a 410 shotgun shell and 22 on it for hunting. But anyway, the ATF got involved and said it had to be registered, and it wasn't, so she either had to find a museum to donate it to, or it had to be destroyed. One of the two. It was a Marble Game Getter was the net brand of it. But this is a typical issue with those particular guns. And she found us, and we didn't have one. We said we would take it, and we had to do all the paperwork with ATF and go through an official gun collector and everything to get it. But that's just one of those things with it like that.
And one of those things you didn't ever think you'd be doing. I mean, how many times a day in our jobs okay, I didn't know I would ever be doing this. Yeah.
No one ever talked to the ATF.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
No idea that was going to happen. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Well, and also things like NAGPRA. I mean, any of us who have had stuff in our collection that those three little words attached to the accession records, found in grave. I mean,
and
going
you brought
through
up the
that
next
process.
point.
Well, I was
Yeah.
gonna say, I'm guessing that's where he was going with Nicole.
Yeah,
Oh.
it's that one, the unique and special nature of human remains and funerary and sacred objects is recognized as the basis of all decisions concerning such collections. So, yeah, I don't know if Nicole can easily chime. It's like going, so how are they developing better with? They mainly focus on Native American objects. So,
I think I got my. Can you guys hear me?
yes.
Yay!
Oh, yay!
Yes, we can hear
Yay!
you.
I'm on my phone. I had to start this by driving earlier, so I was on my phone. But yeah, so on NAGPRA, we haven't had, at least while I've been here, we haven't had any issues so far. But a lot of, and I think Arkansas, either Arkansas State Parks or someone works with the Caddo Nation a lot to return human remains that are found in, I think that's Southwest Arkansas.
Oh, that's probably Carl Drexler. He's the
Yeah.
station archaeologist down
Yes,
there.
yes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, but I know that we kind of have approached it in a very similar way, but I believe most everything we have is not considered a sacred object right now. So that's good for now. But we've also just consulted with any of the cultural museums or cultural preservation offices and things like that they each tribe has. And that's probably, I don't know a whole lot into that. That's probably more our curator on that side. But I know that so far we haven't had any issues, but definitely as they're going to come up, and I know they will.
Mhm.
So it's definitely good to, that's kind of why I actually joined the session for sure, was to kind of that code of ethics and things like that on those things. But yeah, we haven't had any issues so far, but.
Now you have items that come from even South America, correct?
Yes, sir.
And now is what you tried to do with those, I mean, is it documented and approved and signed over, I guess?
Mm-hmm. As far as I know, and I could be wrong, but yeah, as far as I know, and I know a lot of our South American items came from one man had been given them by when he visited Peru or somewhere in South America. And I could be butchering this because we just have so much, but I know that a lot of them were just a part of one collection. And so I'm not sure how that worked for accession purposes and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But we're learning. I'm learning, me personally. There's a lot.
I have a Jimmy classmate who works at the Florida Museum of Natural History, and they apparently have this huge collection of mummified Native American remains. And through lots of years of negotiation and legal wrangling, it's been determined, so they have to keep them. And they have to keep them, in an appropriate environment in these giant coolers and things like that, but they're not allowed to ever display them. And they technically belong to the tribe, and I forget which tribe it is, but yeah, they have to pay for their preservation in perpetuity. And that's the deal they had to make. They're paying for the sins of their fathers, if you will. And but it is a huge, and something I never considered, because they also can't do anything with them and have to show, like, I think, funerary and sacred objects. It's considered that. So
Yeah. And
interesting.
Yeah.
that is really interesting. And I probably would love to reach out to them and kind of just see how that went for them, because I'm sure at some point in the future that will happen. And especially for sacred objects, like just not being displayed. And if that's something that comes up, because I know there are several things that could be considered sacred objects, but after consulting, we haven't had any of those issues yet. So I'm sure that will be coming up. So it's good to know.
both my previous institutions, the Shiloh Museum and the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, have NAGPRA issues. They're as compliant as they can be, but the university, of course, being a higher entity of education, I'm trying to remember, I want to say they have something like 10,000 individual human remains. And a lot of them were, they were bought from scientific companies and are like completely articulated skeletons that were used in classes back in the day and everything. And so, a lot of those, even from scientific companies, they're real human remains. And a lot of times they weren't even all one person. They were put together from a number of people. But I do remember while I was working there was a tribe who went through the process to claim some of the remains, and they were from America Samoa. And it was very interesting when they came and they got it, and it was a beautiful ceremony. And they took the remains with them and everything. And I've also been on an archaeology dig in Oregon where we found fossilized remains in the entire dig site. We had to shut down for 2 days. And that was a really interesting process because I had never been a part of that before in an archaeology situation, but the entire site was shut down immediately. And then little by little, they reopened like certain pits in certain areas that we were digging in until like through the whole 2-day process, everything got reopened. And I thought it was really interesting because when we first hit it, I was like, well, that's it. That's going to cancel the season. We're going to be done, because I had heard other people in Arkansas talking about what happened when they found remains. But apparently out there, it happens so frequently, they have a pretty fast process, and it only took 2 days. But the tribe came out, and we had a ceremony and a smoking ceremony and everything, and we just took the remains. It was 2 pieces of a skull that we had found, and we took them probably about 500 yards away from where we were digging and reburied them. And had a ceremony and just reburied them right there. And all the archaeologists in Oregon were going around, they were making very detailed notes on where that burial was, because they were like, we don't want to redig this up and go through this again. Because it was out in the middle of the desert. So it wasn't like, if I recall correctly, I think there's somewhere here in Arkansas that's a designated part of a cemetery for repatriation, but it wasn't like that there in Oregon. So there's every chance that it could be redug if they aren't careful.
One of the things to point out here is, I think this is a key too, is when we talk about, like Heather Marie pointed out with artwork, and then other of us have ways we get things we dig session. But disposal of collections through sale, trade, or research, the Code of Ethics doesn't say you can't sell them. You can, but that doesn't need to be for the profit of someone. That money needs to go back to be used for that acquisition of other items that fit your mission or direct care of the collection. So potentially a building to take care of the collection, those type of things like that. Is it being used to get increased salaries for the board members or something like that? That's a different story with it. Again, the main thing is like, this is for the public good rather than individual financial gain.
Yeah, that's one of the interesting things. The most recent story, the Brooklyn Museum of Art is deaccessioning some artworks, and the money is going to go towards paying some of the salary of their collections management staff.
Oh.
Because of COVID and them shutting down, they've lost so much revenue and everything that they're in danger of having to let their staff go. And so that becomes the question of, is this still ethical for them to do that in order to save their staff? or lose the staff
Yeah.
that has the expertise to take care of their collection,
Yeah.
you know.
Uh-huh.
And from my understanding, AAM and the AAMD both came out and said that it was within the ethical code for them to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I found that interesting.
That's an interesting point right there.
But you
Yeah.
also run the risk of like the public, like if we had a little sale of some of our things that aren't accessioned, but there would be political memorabilia collectors' dreams. I mean, the public perception could be that you're selling off your collections and not
And that's
making the public good. And even though what you're doing is completely okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's exactly what Brooklyn's running into. Like the public is having in Brooklyn and New York is having a mass hysteria
Yeah.
about it.
I wonder if any of those with the massive hysteria are donating money to help save those salaries.
I'm gonna guess not.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I always think like, yo, if you want to get worked up, then pony up. So
Exactly.
And that communication is sort of summed up on that bottom line where it says competing claims of ownership or questions and so forth. Just be clear and upfront with public. I think mainly, I think the point is trying to say, and particularly I had this situation happen before where, and some of y'all may have had as well, a descendant, their grandmother donated this item, and then later the descendants come in and say like, now wait a minute, they donated that, I want that back. And I have to say, well, I'm sorry, but they did sign it over, and I showed them the deed of gift and I said, here it is. But at the same time, I want you to know is we use this item quite a bit in taking it to programs and so forth and letting people know about it. So it's getting a lot of publicity at the same time with your family's name attached to it. So those things. I know we're time, so I'll go quickly to the next one with that. Let's see if it'll let me. Just real quick, we can put this PowerPoint there for y'all to look at, but this is a link to the Museum Property Act of Arkansas. It's good to know if you ever have any issues like, you know, undocumented property that you don't know where it came from, but after, I believe it's 7 years, it becomes your property if you keep it documented for 7 years. So that's just something good to know. There is that protection for museums with items like that. Program, this just quickly sum up on the program side, education side of this, is program support. Again, it all goes back to that mission again and public trust. They're founded on scholarship and marked by intellectual integrity. So know what you're talking about. I think we've talked about in sessions before. People, when they talk about their trust level, they really put museums pretty high up there. When they read something or hear something from a museum, the trust is pretty high on what they're hearing a lot of times than from someone else through that. So that puts us up on a high pedestal that we always have to be mindful of. But always try to keep things backed up with what you're portraying and doing. Make sure programs are accessible, encourage participation the widest possible, respect different views and traditions and concerns, which is definitely relevant to today with that. And revenue producing activities getting involved with other entities, but make sure, again, that goes back to your mission. We have one program that we connect with our local community college. We've been actually doing this since the 80s, but they teach bladesmith making classes, how to make knives. And we have that connection because we're touted as the home of the Bowie knife. So we have Smith Shop, which is one of the top favorite spots in the park. But we have that to encourage people to learn how to make knives. So we have that collaboration with local community college on how to do that. Any questions on that or conflicts? Do we have to shut off right at 3:15? Angie? Okay. I will say there was one video I was trying to find to put with this, but it was one I was shown back when I took art appreciation in undergrad. But it was an old episode of Murphy Brown. Heather Marie may find this funny with it since she's in an art museum. But Murphy Brown, that's that lady's show. She goes to do a show, art exhibit, and the art exhibit is this big pile of Sweenlow packets. And so the whole
Remember
episode is
that
about like,
one.
what is art? And they're wanting to sell it for like $10,000. You're just like going, this isn't art. So this is the kind of like in our different realms, you know, your exhibits and activities. Any comments or questions in regards to that?
Let's not talk about how much we spent on a pile of candy to put on the floor.
I was exactly thinking that same thing. I wasn't going to say a word, but I thought, I've been to Crystal Bridges and I have had some of that apple candy on the floor.
Well, there you go. It's relevant.
It made an impression. That's all I gotta say.
And what's crazy is we actually only paid for the concept.
Oh.
Like that. We paid for that concept. We didn't actually pay for the candy. You had to pay for that separately.
That sounds like a lot of fun for a bookkeeper. Where do I tag the
Where do you
pile of
code?
candy?
What account code does the candy go in?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm not in collections. I don't have to do that math as far as how many pieces of candy are taken.
Now, I know we have a lot of educators out there. I mean, have y'all run into any issues or, you know, see things that you've done that seem to conflict with this or understand the conflicts or understand what it's saying? Any examples?
I think this kind of goes to what you were talking about, Josh. We all need revenue producing activities. Well, I mean, we might not. I mean, in general, it's something that's always discussed, right? And so, yeah, and the IRS consider certain things, like if you showed Nightmare Before Halloween or whatever the movie was, that would be unrelated business income tax. So let's say you made a pile of money on it, but because it doesn't match your mission, the IRS would tax it. And so there's a whole separate issue to go with that. And at the same time, though, is it so terrible? Or like venue rentals. We have done some of that, and is that part of our mission? I don't know. We're a community resource, but at the same time, it could be kind of questionable.
And with that, I mean, because we rent out building. We have one that we just finished restoring. It was a house built in 1860. That's now a rental facility. But an issue there is, I think we want to use it and it to be a facility people can use for events, but it's also balancing too proper guidelines that help still protect the building too. I know, I think I see Amanda here, like with Old State House. I sometimes get upset with it because I'm a dancer, but we can't dance on that second floor. Just can't.
No, the fire marshal deemed the floor unstable.
Right.
So that's why.
I would love to.
We want to too, believe me.
Yeah. But can't do it. But those are things right there to, again, but y'all rent it, right, Amanda? People can use it outside of COVID.
No, we don't rent that space. We only do in-house programs. Or, like Second Friday Art Night concerts, that kind of thing.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah. I'm sorry.
We rent our front lawn, but that's it.
You're right. Yeah. I know sometimes it gets to come to, because even with us as agencies and entities, like more even now, they want to see us turn a profit. So they want income. They're just going to give us money. They want to see that happening and get that income coming in too at the same time. So it's trying to do stuff that makes income, not be outrageous with it either. Again, the goal being for the public trust, public good, but at the same time, also taking care of your resource and your collection with that.
I'd like to speak slightly to the one right above that too, as a challenge as well. Um,
The
our job,
pluralistic values.
yeah,
Mhm.
is meeting the challenge of being accurate to our site and the views and the people, you know, the views expressed in 19th century newspapers, let's face it, are not usually currently politically correct and or acceptable. So how to present what happened without being insensitive to other people is a challenge of you know, I mean, historical interpretation is how do we include the views of, I mean, Dachau and Auschwitz have the same problem, obviously, you know, of how do we present this history accurately, but still with
With respect.
exactly.
And with that, example I will point out there, and this is for in regard to history museum, but I mean, all of us, science museums run this, art museums run this with different things that they would present. I mean, everyone does. But one example I think of is, because we do history, is Colonial Williamsburg. This a few years ago, they started doing this, but they did a reenactment of a slave sale. And they went different protocols to make it happen and communicated that clearly to the public. And with the visitors that came, it was very well received. I think from what I understood, the ones that did not go to it, that didn't see it in action, they were critiquing it, but the public that came to see it thought it was very well presented, showing, you know, kind of the drama and the shock of something like that. And they forewarned people too, saying, this is what you're about to see. And this is why, and, you know, this is what life was like in the 19th century. That. But it's not just easily into though.
Well, SCMC had a great session about trauma to the interpreter, and there was a blog for a long time called Ask a Slave, and she wrote about being a Black woman doing living history at Mount Vernon and portraying an enslaved person there, and some of the long-lasting damage it had on her and how it became kind of traumatic. And when she was doing that, people treated her a certain way that was really ugly. And
when you
but
say
then she also
public or staff?
she was no, the public did. And but then also she felt herself taking on some of those, you know, internalizing some things too. And she doesn't write that blog anymore, but it was really interesting. And the SCMC session about the trauma to interpreters was also really interesting, and probably something, like, I think we're mostly white here, probably something that we don't really think about that much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then talk about ethics, like you said, Josh, like in what you said, Angela, how do you teach about a slave auction and you want to do it respectfully? And is it by doing a live one or not? And I don't know the answer to that. That sounds hard to me.
It is, yeah, which is good. And I guess part of this, know your audience too, and your crowd that comes to your museum, and what they expect of you in a way. I think Colonial Williamsburg has been always doing the living history for a long time. So people know that for them, they're known for it in a way. Whereas if another museum like, and I'm just one of our local ones here in Arkansas did that, it may be a harder sell. Just because we haven't built up that type of large reputation like that, in that sense.
And I think too, I mean, pretty much everybody I'm seeing works in a history museum is not just the 19th century, but there are, history is ugly.
Mhm.
I mean, to be frank, I mean, there's a lot of, it's not pretty, it's not, I mean, I'm not saying there aren't good stories out there, but it's not tied up with a bow or a ribbon a lot of times. And again, if this year has taught us nothing else, it's we, you know, and talking, you know, reevaluating the old programs. How do we present this? Speaking to our own site, we have a Confederate monument. It's a statue on a pillar of a Civil War soldier. The four sides of the base have the list of who was in the local unit and the battles they fought in. Was put up by the local veterans of the local unit to, with the stated purpose of commemorating their fallen comrades. That's the gist of it. But our interpreter has done a program, or has developed a program, I don't think she's presented it yet, that I think handled it very well, in that she took three or four local individuals. One was a former slave, one was someone who served in the unit, and a third is, I think, a lady who lived here during the war is the third perspective. But it's, what do you think this monument would have meant to these people? Because each one of them is going to have a very different view of what that means. And then the last question, of course, is, you know, what does it mean to you, the visitor? Because we have sons of Confederate veterans here, we have African-American families here, we have families from the North, we have families from the South. I mean, we have this wide view of perspectives. It's going to be something different. So it's again, how do you tell those accurate but ugly stories in a respectful manner is going to be just part of our, hopefully part of our consciousness, and taking that on.
One quick question I wanted to add, because I know we'll wrap up, but it's kind of along this a similar schedule in art museum. Henry, have you run into the secret bridges with a particular exhibit that may be a little controversial? Is she there?
I don't think so.
Okay.
But I know they did. They did have an exhibit that I actually saw in San Jose, California, that a couple of years later, I think it was called Border Songs, and it's photography along the Mexican-American border. And there was a lot of controversy about that. And I don't know the specifics of it exactly, but I know they've had it.
Okay. Gotcha.
I think all of us who live here in Arkansas, when the Clinton name comes up, that stirs up a lot of feelings, all the feelings. So there's that.
Well, Angie, I will say, and I know this from the national park being down from me in the town I grew up in Hope. That's one of the most difficult things I would almost say is having a house of a person that's still alive. I mean, they're still alive and doing things. So, I mean,
and saying things, and the public perception and interest in them is ever evolving. And so it's a reminder to be in this for the long game, because he's still going to have been the 42nd president. She was still going to have been the first female candidate of a major party, you know, and Secretary of State. But we have to be looking at 20, 30, and 50 years from now, and 100 years from now, not just today.
Yeah.
But sometimes when you're getting graffitied, or, you know, terrible comments on TripAdvisor or something, that's the reality. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know we've gone a little bit over, but that's, I don't know if we have any other questions. I know we could keep talking forever probably on some of this with each other, but if there are not other questions or comments, I guess that ends the presentation or discussion.
Okay. Well, thank you, Josh, for leading this. And some of you will notice, and I will send it out in a email as well, but there is an evaluation form and there's a link to that in the chat. And like I'll send it out too, but in that evaluation is a place for you to mention other topics. So if there's anything else that you want to think that we should be addressing in these sessions, please let us know. We appreciate it. So thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thank you for being.
Bye. Thank you, Josh.
You're welcome.